March 4, 1943. 32,000 feet above the Rohr Valley, Germany. Second Lieutenant James Hargrove pressed his eye against the Norden bombsight, watching the target shimmer in the crosshairs through waves of flak smoke. The chemical plant below, sprawled across 6 acres of German industrial heartland, represented everything the 8th Air Force had been sent to destroy. But Hargrove's hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the 40 below temperature. Through his headset, he could hear the voices of 7 other bombardiers in the formation, all calling out different estimates for the initial point. 7 different voices, 7 different calculations, 7 different release points. In 90 seconds, when the lead bombardier toggled his bombs, the other 53 aircraft in the formation would follow. But if each plane released independently based on what their individual bombardiers calculated, those bombs would scatter across 15 square miles of German countryside. Most would hit farmland, some would hit villages, almost none would hit the target. The Americans had just flown 8 hours through fighter attacks and flak to accomplish precisely nothing. This wasn't theoretical, this was the operational reality facing every heavy bomber mission over Europe in early 1943. American crews possessed the most sophisticated bombsight ever created, the legendary Norden device that promised circular error probability of under 75 feet from 25,000 feet. They flew the toughest bomber ever built, the B-17 Flying Fortress that could absorb punishment no other aircraft could survive. They had the courage to penetrate hundreds of miles into defended airspace, facing odds that killed or captured 3 out of 4 crews before they completed their tours. But despite all of this, technological superiority, industrial might, and extraordinary bravery, American strategic bombing was failing at its primary mission. The bombs weren't hitting the targets. The issue wasn't the Norden bombsight itself, though crews joked bitterly about the device being worth its weight in gold, and occasionally about as useful. The Norden was genuinely revolutionary, an analog computer weighing about 50 pounds that calculated trajectory, windage, altitude, airspeed, and bombing angle in real time. When properly calibrated and operated by a skilled bombardier in stable conditions, it could drop bombs with remarkable precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem was that stable conditions didn't exist over defended German targets. Strategic bombing doctrine in 1942 and early 1943 emphasized individual accuracy. Each bomber carried its own bombardier who made independent calculations and released bombs based on his own judgment. The theory held that 10 skilled bombardiers would achieve better results than 1 bombardier controlling releases for 10 aircraft. More calculations meant more opportunities to account for variables like wind drift, altitude changes, and target movement. This made perfect sense in peacetime training exercises over the Nevada desert, where bombers flew at comfortable altitudes in clear weather with no one shooting at them. Over Germany, the theory collapsed under the weight of operational reality. The first problem was the bomb run itself. Accurate bombing required flying straight and level for approximately 3 to 5 minutes, while the bombardier adjusted the Norden and established the correct approach angle. During those minutes, the bomber became predictable. German flak batteries could calculate trajectories and fill the sky with 88mm shells that detonated in black clouds of shrapnel. Pilots described it as flying through a forest of explosions, each one capable of shredding aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency, staying straight and level while the aircraft rocked from near misses, while fragments punched holes through the fuselage, while you watched other bombers in the formation take direct hits and fall away trailing fire, required iron discipline that went against every survival instinct. But the bombardiers demanded it, and the mission required it, so pilots held course and prayed. The second problem was that each bombardier saw the target differently. From 25,000 feet, industrial complexes looked like geometric patterns of rectangles and squares rendered in shades of grey. Identifying the specific building or structure designated as the aiming point required comparing what you saw through the bombsight to reconnaissance photos taken days earlier, often from different angles and different altitudes. In clear conditions with unlimited visibility, experienced bombardiers could make positive identification. In combat conditions, with smoke from previous raids obscuring ground details, with the aircraft bouncing from flak, with fighters attacking and the tail gunner screaming warnings over the intercom. Positive identification became educated guessing. Different bombardiers would identify different buildings as the primary target. Some might aim for the northwest corner of the complex, where the assembly building stood. Others might aim for the southeast corner where fuel storage tanks clustered. Still others might aim for what they thought was the center of the facility. When each aircraft released independently, bomb patterns reflected these discrepancies. Instead of a concentrated strike that overwhelmed the target with explosive force, bombs scattered across the landscape in a loose pattern that might span 2 or 3 miles. Reconnaissance photos from the March 4th raid on the IG Farben chemical plant showed this pattern with depressing clarity. Of the 640 bombs dropped by 54 B-17 seconds, fewer than 80 hit within the plant boundaries. That's a success rate of roughly 12%. The rest impacted in surrounding fields, residential areas, and neighboring industrial facilities that weren't targeted. The plant resumed operations within 48 hours. The third problem, and perhaps the most significant, was synchronization, or rather the complete lack of it. Even when bombardiers agreed on the target and made accurate calculations, they released bombs at different moments. The Norden bombsight included an automatic release mechanism triggered when the site's crosshairs aligned perfectly with the calculated impact point, but this alignment happened at slightly different instants for each bombardier, depending on their individual calculations for wind drift, altitude, and approach angle. A difference of just 2 seconds between the first and last bomber releasing meant bombs impacted 400 yards apart at typical bomber speeds. Multiply those timing variations across dozens of aircraft, and precision bombing became area saturation, with most of the saturated area being empty countryside. The cumulative effect of these problems meant that despite flying through deadly defenses and losing crews at catastrophic rates, American heavy bombers were achieving marginal results. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of mission reports and compared them with bomb damage assessments conducted after the war. The data revealed uncomfortable truths. During the period from August 1942 through February 1943, when independent bombing was standard doctrine, American heavy bombers achieved an average circular error probability of approximately 1,400 feet. That meant half of all bombs dropped fell within a circle 1,400 feet in radius around the aim point, roughly half a mile across. For comparison, precision bombing was defined as achieving CEP under 500 feet. The Americans were missing that standard by nearly a mile. These weren't minor discrepancies. These were systemic failures that undermined the entire strategic bombing campaign. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force from December 1942, understood the scope of the problem. In February 1943, he attended a meeting at High Wycombe where staff officers presented loss statistics and damage assessments from recent missions. The numbers were devastating. The 8th was losing bombers faster than replacement crews could be trained and integrated into combat groups. Meanwhile, target damage was insufficient to justify the losses. At the current rate of attrition versus operational effectiveness, the strategic bombing campaign would collapse before achieving meaningful results. Something had to change fundamentally and immediately. The solution emerged from an unexpected source, not from high-level strategic planning or advanced weapons development, but from the operational experience of squadron and group commanders who'd been flying combat missions since the campaign began. These officers, many of them in their mid-20s, had watched dozens of missions scatter bombs across German countryside. They'd studied reconnaissance photos, they'd talked with their bombardiers about the challenges of independent bombing under combat conditions, and they'd begun experimenting with alternatives. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, had been thinking about bombing accuracy since his first missions in late 1942. LeMay was analytical by temperament, a man who approached problems with mathematical precision and little patience for conventional wisdom that didn't work. His background as one of the Army Air Force's finest navigators had taught him to think systematically about flight paths, timing, and coordination. He applied that same thinking to bombing tactics. LeMay observed that the Norden bombsight's theoretical accuracy assumed ideal conditions that never existed in combat. He also recognized that trying to create ideal conditions for dozens of individual bombardiers simultaneously was impossible. What if, instead, you created ideal conditions for one bombardier and had everyone else follow his lead? The concept was simple, almost obvious in retrospect, but represented a radical departure from existing doctrine. Select your most skilled bombardier, give him the best possible conditions to make accurate calculations, and have every other bomber in the formation release when he released. Instead of dozens of independent calculations subject to individual error and timing discrepancies, you'd have one calculation replicated across the entire formation. LeMay began testing this approach in January 1943 during missions against submarine pens in France. The 305th's lead bombardier would make his calculations and release. The instant his bombs left the aircraft, he'd trigger a flare that shot from the bomber's tail. Every bombardier in the formation would toggle their release switches the moment they saw that flare. The results weren't immediately transformative, mostly because the concept required refinement and because early attempts still used relatively loose formations where timing delays between seeing the flare and releasing bombs created scatter. But the improvement was measurable. Reconnaissance photos showed tighter bomb patterns, more hits within target boundaries, and noticeably better concentration of explosive force. Other group commanders noticed. By March 1943, several bombardment groups were experimenting with variations of formation bombing. Some used radio signals instead of visual flares. Others had bombardiers toggle electrical switches that lit panels visible to following aircraft. The specific mechanisms varied, but the underlying concept remained constant. One bombardier calculates, everyone else replicates. The transformation of this tactical experiment into standard doctrine required overcoming significant institutional resistance. Bombardiers had trained for months to master the Norden sight. They took professional pride in their individual accuracy. Being told to simply wait for a lead bombardier's signal and toggle their switches felt like being reduced to automatons. It diminished their role and questioned their competence. Squadron commanders had to explain repeatedly that formation bombing didn't reflect on individual bombardier skill. It was a mathematical solution to a synchronization problem that no amount of individual skill could solve. Pilots raised different concerns. Formation bombing required flying even tighter formations than the combat box defensive formation LeMay had developed. To minimize timing delays between when the lead aircraft released and when following aircraft replicated that release, bombers needed to fly with wingtips separated by as little as 30 to 40 feet. At those distances, any pilot error, any sudden control movement, could trigger a mid-air collision that would destroy multiple aircraft instantly. Flying that tight for 8 hours through combat conditions demanded concentration that pushed even experienced pilots to their limits. The technical challenges were equally significant. Formation bombing required identifying and training lead crews who would bear responsibility for accuracy across the entire formation. These weren't just good crews. These were the absolute best bombardiers, the most stable pilots, the finest navigators. They needed additional training in procedures for leading formations, understanding radio protocols, and making decisions under pressure that would affect hundreds of lives and millions of dollars worth of equipment and ordnance. The 8th Air Force established lead crew training programs at bases across England. Bombardiers spent additional hours on practice ranges. Pilots flew hundreds of formation practice missions. Navigators learned to coordinate with group commanders and adjust flight paths based on weather and tactical conditions. The investment of time and resources was substantial, but the operational necessity was undeniable. Independent bombing wasn't working. Formation bombing was the only viable alternative. The first large-scale test of standardized formation bombing came on May 21, 1943. The target was the submarine construction yards at Wilhelmshaven, a heavily defended facility on Germany's North Sea coast. 200 bombers from multiple groups attacked in coordinated waves, each group flying in combat box formation with designated lead crews controlling bomb release. Weather conditions were nearly ideal for the mission. Visibility exceeded 10 miles. Flak was moderate. Luftwaffe fighter opposition, while present, was lighter than expected because German fighters were being drawn off to defend against RAF attacks elsewhere. The lead bombardiers had clear views of the target and adequate time to make precise calculations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed the target area the following day, the results exceeded expectations. Of approximately 2,400 bombs dropped, over 40% impacted within the shipyard boundaries. Specific buildings designated as primary aiming points showed direct hits and severe structural damage. The concentration of explosive force was unlike anything achieved in previous missions. Instead of scattered impacts that distributed destruction across multiple square miles, the bombs had fallen in dense patterns that overwhelmed local defenses and fire suppression capabilities. Entire sections of the facility were rendered inoperable. The submarine construction schedule was delayed by an estimated 6 weeks. The operational significance extended beyond damage to a single target. Formation bombing had achieved roughly triple the hit rate of independent bombing. The 40% hit rate at Wilhelmshaven, compared to typical 12 to 14% hit rates from previous large raids, represented a fundamental increase in bombing effectiveness. Suddenly, the strategic bombing campaign had a viable path forward. If American bombers could consistently achieve 40% hit rates, they could systematically destroy German industrial capacity, even accounting for the time required to repair and rebuild facilities. The mathematics of industrial attrition finally favored the attackers. General Eaker reviewed the reconnaissance photos and damage assessments from Wilhelmshaven with his staff. The decision was straightforward. Formation bombing would become standard doctrine across all 8th Air Force heavy bombardment groups effective immediately. Training programs were expanded. Lead crew selection became a formal process with specific qualification standards. Radio equipment was modified to improve reliability of release signals. Formation bombing tactics were refined based on lessons learned from each mission. By June 1943, every B-17 and B-24 group in England had transitioned to formation bombing. The tactical implementation required solving numerous technical problems that hadn't been apparent during initial experiments. The most critical was determining optimal formation spacing for bombing runs. The combat box formation designed for defensive firepower placed aircraft at intervals that maximized overlapping fields of fire, typically 50 to 75 feet between wingtips and 100 to 150 feet between altitude layers. But those spacing distances created timing problems for bomb release. When the lead bombardier toggled his bombs and fired the release flare, crews in following aircraft needed roughly 1 to 2 seconds to react and replicate the release. During those seconds, at typical bombing speeds of 180 miles per hour, the formation traveled approximately 500 feet. Aircraft, flying 150 feet behind the lead bomber, were releasing their bombs 500 feet farther along the flight path. At 25,000 feet altitude, bombs took approximately 40 seconds to fall. Wind drift during that time could move bombs laterally by several hundred feet. When combined with the forward travel distance caused by timing delays, bombs from aircraft in the rear of the formation impacted significantly behind bombs from the lead aircraft. The solution required compressing formations during the bomb run. Starting approximately 10 minutes before reaching the initial point, formations would tighten. Wingtip spacing decreased to 30 to 40 feet. Altitude separation between layers compressed to 50 feet. Aircraft in trail closed up to within 75 feet of the bomber ahead. These distances were dangerous, leaving almost no margin for error, but they reduced timing delays between release signals and actual bomb drops. The tighter the formation, the more concentrated the bomb pattern. Pilots described flying bombing run formation as the most demanding flying they'd ever experienced. Maintaining position required constant attention to power settings, trim adjustments, and control inputs. At 30-foot wingtip separation, you could see the rivets on the adjacent aircraft. You could see the pilot's face. Any sudden movement by that pilot, any turbulence from flak, any need to adjust power, could put aircraft on collision courses. The concentration required was absolute. You couldn't look away. You couldn't relax. For the entire bomb run, typically 5 to 8 minutes, pilots flew with their hands welded to the controls and their eyes locked on adjacent aircraft. The bombardiers faced different but equally intense pressure. The lead bombardier knew that dozens of aircraft were waiting for his signal. Hundreds of men were depending on his calculations. Millions of dollars worth of ordnance would impact wherever he determined. The weight of that responsibility sat alongside the technical demands of operating the Norden site, while the aircraft rocked from flak bursts and fighters attacked the formation. Lead bombardiers developed reputations within groups based on their accuracy. Crews wanted to fly with bombardiers who consistently hit targets. Poor bombardiers found themselves reassigned or removed from lead crew duties after missions where bombs scattered uselessly across empty terrain. The psychological toll was substantial. In his post-war memoir, Captain Robert Morgan, who served as a bombardier with the 91st Bomb Group, described the experience of leading formations over Germany. He wrote about the moment when you triggered the bomb release, knowing that every aircraft behind you would replicate your action. If you'd calculated correctly, if you'd accounted for wind and altitude and approach angle properly, dozens of tons of high explosive would destroy the target. If you'd made an error, if you'd misidentified the aiming point or miscalculated the wind drift, those bombs would hit civilians or miss entirely. The consequences of success and failure were measured in human lives and strategic outcomes. That knowledge never left you, not during missions, and not afterward, when you tried to sleep. The deputy lead position became institutionalized as formations grew larger. By late 1943, typical combat wings included 54 aircraft flying in 3 groups of 18 bombers each. The lead group contained the primary lead crew, whose bombardier controlled releases for the entire wing, but if the lead aircraft was shot down or damaged, the formation needed immediate continuity. The deputy lead aircraft, flying in the number 2 position directly behind, or alongside the primary lead, was crewed by equally qualified personnel, trained to assume control instantly if necessary. Radio communication protocols were standardized to minimize confusion during bombing runs. 10 minutes before the initial point, the lead navigator would radio all aircraft to prepare for the bomb run. This was the signal for formations to tighten and for bombardiers to begin setting up their sights. 5 minutes out, another radio call confirmed everyone was in position. At 2 minutes, lead bombardiers would announce bombs away in 2 minutes, giving following bombardiers final warning to prepare. The actual release signal came as a combination of visual and radio confirmation. The lead bombardier would announce bombs away on the radio, while simultaneously triggering colored smoke flares from the tail of his aircraft. Bombardiers in following aircraft would toggle their releases the instant they saw the flares or heard the radio call, whichever came first. This redundancy ensured that even if radio communications were jammed or if visual signals were obscured by smoke, at least one method would get through. The system worked reliably in practice, though refinements continued throughout the war as groups learned from operational experience. Weather remained the primary variable that complicated formation bombing. Unlike individual bombing, where each bombardier could adjust for local conditions, formation bombing required that all aircraft encounter similar conditions during the bomb run. Cloud layers that obscured the target from some aircraft while leaving it visible to others created situations where following bombardiers were releasing blind, trusting that the lead crew could see what they couldn't. The 8th Air Force developed H-2X radar bombing systems, starting in late 1943 specifically to address this problem. H-2X, known as Mickey by bomber crews, was a ground-mapping radar that could identify targets through cloud cover. Lead aircraft equipped with H-2X could bomb through weather that would have previously scrubbed missions, but radar bombing reduced accuracy compared to visual bombing. The H-2X radar could distinguish large urban areas and major geographic features like rivers or coastlines, but couldn't resolve individual buildings or structures. When formations bombed using H-2X, they were effectively conducting area bombing rather than precision strikes against specific facilities. This created doctrinal tensions within the 8th Air Force. American bombing policy emphasized precision attacks on specific industrial targets, in contrast to RAF area bombing of German cities. The Americans believed correctly as post-war analysis showed that destroying specific choke points in German industry, such as ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, and aircraft factories, would cripple military production more effectively than indiscriminate city bombing. But H-2X bombing through clouds necessarily meant less precision and more area effect. The compromise was to use H-2X only when weather prevented visual bombing, and to select H-2X targets that were large enough for radar resolution. Oil refineries, which occupied several square miles, became preferred H-2X targets. So did marshalling yards where railroad tracks converged. These facilities were large enough that radar bombing could achieve useful hit rates even with the reduced accuracy. The evolution of German defensive tactics in response to formation bombing demonstrated how tactical innovations drove counter-innovations throughout the air war. Luftwaffe fighter pilots quickly recognized that formation bombing created a vulnerability they could exploit. During the bombing run, when formations were at their tightest and crews were most focused on maintaining position and executing the bomb drop, was when formations were least able to respond to fighter attacks. The bombers were committed to straight and level flight. They couldn't take evasive action. The pilots were concentrating on holding position, not on watching for threats. German fighter groups began timing their attacks to hit formations during the bomb run whenever possible. The tactic was devastatingly effective when executed correctly. Fokker-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s would position themselves along the expected approach route to major targets. They'd wait until American formations entered their bombing runs, easily identifiable because the formations would tighten and lock into straight flight paths. Then the German fighters would attack from head-on, diving through the formations at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. At those closing speeds, bomber gunners had perhaps 3 seconds to engage before the fighters flashed past. The disruption was psychological as much as physical. Even if the fighters didn't score hits, their presence during the critical bombing minutes rattled crews and disrupted bombardier concentration. American formations developed counter-tactics. Additional fighter escorts were assigned specifically to protect formations during bombing runs. These close escort fighters would fly above and slightly ahead of the bomber stream, positioning themselves to intercept German fighters before they could reach the bombers. The combat air patrol became a standard element of mission planning, with specific fighter groups assigned to specific bomber wings to maintain consistent coordination. The bomber crews themselves adapted. Gunners were instructed to maintain defensive fire discipline even during bombing runs, despite the instinct to focus solely on the immediate task. Pilots practiced maintaining formation integrity under simulated attack conditions during training missions. Lead crews developed procedures for continuing the bomb run even if aircraft around them were hit. The determination to complete the bombing run, regardless of opposition, became a point of pride among heavy bomber crews. By August 1943, formation bombing had become so ingrained in 8th Air Force doctrine that mission briefings assumed its use without discussion. The questions were no longer whether to use formation bombing, but rather which crews would lead, what formation spacing would be optimal for expected weather conditions, and how fighter escorts would coordinate their protection during bombing runs. The transformation was complete. What had been experimental in January had become standard operating procedure by summer. The statistical evidence supporting formation bombing accumulated with each mission. The 8th Air Force maintained meticulous records of bombing accuracy, measuring circular error probable for each major raid. The data showed consistent improvement. During the August 17 missions to Regensburg and Schweinfurt, formations achieved hit rates approaching 50% on some target complexes. Despite facing the heaviest fighter opposition and flak defenses the Luftwaffe could muster, the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg sustained damage that halted production for over a month. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, while not destroyed completely, suffered damage that reduced output by approximately 35% for several weeks. These results came at horrific cost. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions lost 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16% that was unsustainable by any measure. But the critical point was that the bombs that did reach the targets hit with unprecedented accuracy. The concentrated impact patterns overwhelmed German repair capabilities in ways that scattered bombing never could. When 50 bombs hit within a 200-yard radius of a critical facility, that facility went offline. It didn't matter how quickly repair crews could work, or how much spare capacity existed elsewhere in the industrial network. Concentrated destruction created bottlenecks that rippled through the entire German war economy. The combined bomber offensive, the coordinated American and British strategic bombing campaign, relied fundamentally on this concentration of force. RAF Bomber Command conducted area attacks by night, creating general destruction across German industrial cities. The 8th and 15th Air Forces conducted precision attacks by day, targeting specific facilities within those cities. The two approaches were complementary. British night raids disrupted transportation, destroyed housing that workers needed, and forced dispersion of industry that made production less efficient. American day raids destroyed the factories themselves, the power plants that supplied them, the transportation infrastructure that moved raw materials and finished products. Formation bombing made the American contribution viable. Without the accuracy improvements that formation bombing provided, daylight precision raids would have continued scattering bombs across countryside with insufficient target damage to justify the losses. The entire American strategic bombing doctrine would have collapsed, forcing either adoption of British-style area bombing or abandonment of the daylight campaign entirely. Formation bombing provided the third option, making precision daylight attacks effective enough to justify their continuation despite the costs. The human dimension of formation bombing deserves particular emphasis because the tactic's success depended entirely on crew skill and discipline under unimaginable pressure. Consider what was required. 10 men, average age 23, many of whom had never flown an aircraft before military training, were expected to fly in formation at 30-foot spacing for 8 to 10 hours. They had to do this at 25,000 feet altitude, where temperatures reached -40 degrees, and oxygen was required for consciousness. They had to maintain that formation while flying through flak that filled the sky with shrapnel, and while being attacked by some of the most skilled fighter pilots in the world flying excellent aircraft. During the bombing run specifically, they had to tighten formation even further, concentrate absolutely on holding position, and trust that the lead bombardier would make accurate calculations while they couldn't see what he was doing or understand his reasoning. Then, at the instant of bomb release, they had to toggle their own releases with precision timing, knowing that errors of even 1 second would scatter their bombs hundreds of feet from the intended impact point. They had to do all of this while watching other aircraft around them take hits, while hearing wounded crew members screaming on the intercom, while dealing with equipment failures and battle damage and the constant, grinding fear that the next flak burst or fighter pass would be the one that got them. The psychological resilience required for this was extraordinary. Studies conducted by Army Air Force's medical officers found that bomber crews in the 8th Air Force experienced psychological stress levels comparable to frontline infantry engaged in sustained combat. The difference was that infantry could take cover, could retreat if necessary, could at least feel they had some agency in their survival. Bomber crews were locked into flying straight and level toward targets while being shot at, unable to take evasive action, entirely dependent on maintaining formation discipline and trusting that the mathematical theory underlying their tactics would give them marginally better odds of survival. The cost in human terms was staggering and must be stated plainly. The 8th Air Force suffered over 47,000 casualties during the combined bomber offensive. 26,000 of those men were killed in action. Another 28,000 were shot down and became prisoners of war, many of them wounded or injured during bailouts. These weren't statistics in some operational analysis. These were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Michigan, many of them barely old enough to vote, who climbed into bombers morning after morning knowing the odds. The survival statistics were brutal. During the period from August 1942 through May 1944, when bomber losses peaked, a crew's probability of completing a 25-mission tour without being killed or shot down was approximately 1 in 4. That's a 75% casualty rate. Even after fighter escort was extended and formation bombing reduced loss rates, completing a tour required extraordinary luck in addition to skill and courage. Every crew understood this. Intelligence officers briefed them on loss rates before missions. They could count the empty beds in their barracks. They attended memorial services for friends who'd been shot down the previous day. The psychological mechanisms that allowed men to continue flying under these conditions were varied and deeply personal. Some men focused on the mission itself, the belief that they were shortening the war and saving lives by destroying German military production. Others relied on superstition, lucky charms, pre-mission rituals that gave them an illusion of control. Many simply compartmentalized, refusing to think beyond the immediate task of getting through the next mission. The camaraderie within crews was intense, born from absolute mutual dependence. You trusted your crew with your life literally and repeatedly. Formation bombing intensified this interdependence. Your survival didn't depend only on your own crew's skill. It depended on every crew in the formation maintaining their position, executing their role, and holding together under fire. The formations worked because hundreds of crews did this simultaneously. That collective discipline, that shared commitment to tactical doctrine, even when it contradicted survival instinct, represented one of the most remarkable achievements of American military training and leadership. The technical refinements to formation bombing continued throughout the war as groups learned from operational experience and as new equipment became available. The introduction of the G model B 17 inches, late 1943, brought improved defensive armament, including a chin turret that addressed the aircraft's vulnerability to head-on attacks. This allowed formations to maintain tighter spacing during bombing runs without accepting increased risk from frontal fighter attacks that had previously been most dangerous when formations were compressed. Improved radio equipment reduced communication problems that had plagued early formation bombing missions. The SCR 522 command radio set, introduced in 1944, provided reliable voice communication across formations, even in heavy jamming environments. Lead bombardiers could provide running commentary to following crews during bombing runs, updating them on conditions and confirming target identification. This reduced the anxiety that came from blind trust in led crews whose decision processes following bombardiers couldn't observe. The development of formation assembly procedures represented another significant tactical innovation driven by the requirements of formation bombing. Before formation bombing became standard, groups assembled relatively loose formations over England before heading to continental Europe. The assembly typically took 30 to 40 minutes and wasn't particularly demanding. Once formation bombing required tighter spacing and more precise positioning, assembly became more complex and time-consuming. Groups needed to form up with each aircraft in its exact assigned position, squadron leaders correctly placed, group leaders properly positioned relative to wing leaders. The solution was the assembly ship, also called a Judas Goat by crews. These were war-weary B-17 seconds that had completed combat tours, but were no longer mission-capable. Groups would paint these aircraft in distinctive patterns, often using bright colors and geometric designs that were visible from miles away. The assembly ship would take off first, fly to a designated assembly point, and orbit at specific altitude while flying distinctive patterns. The other aircraft in the group would locate the assembly ship, join on it, and take their assigned positions. Once the full formation was assembled, the assembly ship would peel off and return to base while the formation continued to the target. This standardized procedure reduced assembly time and ensured formations crossed the English coast properly configured for combat and bombing operations. The strategic impact of improved bombing accuracy manifested in specific target systems that German industry struggled to protect or repair. The synthetic oil campaign launched in May 1944 demonstrated formation bombing's effectiveness against distributed target sets. Germany produced synthetic fuel from coal using Fischer-Tropsch plants located throughout the Reich. These facilities couldn't be moved or significantly dispersed. They required specific infrastructure and took years to construct. They were ideal targets for precision bombing. Starting with the first attacks on Lohner and Pollitt's synthetic oil plants in May 1944, American formations systematically destroyed German fuel production. The concentrated bomb patterns that formation bombing produced overwhelmed repair capabilities. Even when plants weren't completely destroyed, damage to critical components like oxygen separation units or catalyst chambers halted production for weeks. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had fallen to approximately 30% of pre-campaign levels. This collapse in fuel availability crippled Luftwaffe operations, limiting pilot training and reducing combat sorties. It also affected Wehrmacht mobility on all fronts, as panzer divisions and motorized infantry ran short of fuel. The transportation campaign that followed in late 1944 demonstrated formation bombing's effectiveness against network targets. Instead of attacking individual factories, formations bombed marshalling yards, railroad bridges, and canal locks that connected industrial facilities to the front lines. A 50% hit rate against a railroad bridge meant the bridge was down. A 40% hit rate against a marshalling yard meant the yard couldn't function efficiently. These were binary results. Either the transportation infrastructure worked, or it didn't. Formation bombing provided the accuracy necessary to achieve those binary results consistently. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined German industrial records and conducted extensive interviews with German economic officials. The survey concluded that strategic bombing was decisive in collapsing German war production during the final year of the war. The specific attribution of bombing effectiveness to formation bombing tactics versus other factors like fighter escort or improved aircraft is impossible to isolate completely. All these elements worked together as an integrated system. But the survey data showed clearly that bombing accuracy improved substantially after formation bombing became standard doctrine, and that improved accuracy translated directly to increased target damage and reduced German industrial capacity. The legacy of formation bombing extended beyond World War II into Cold War strategic doctrine. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the lessons learned from formation bombing influenced organizational structure and tactical planning. Strategic Air Command, established in 1946, emphasized crew discipline, standardized procedures, and formation tactics as core competencies. The B, 29 seconds, and later B, 36 seconds that constituted America's nuclear deterrent trained extensively in formation flying and formation bombing tactics, even though actual nuclear war plans envisioned aircraft operating independently. The emphasis on standardization and procedural discipline that formation bombing required shaped how SAC operated for decades. Curtis LeMay, who had pioneered formation bombing tactics with the 305th Bomb Group and later commanded the 20th Air Force in the Pacific, became commanding general of SAC in 1948. He brought with him the operational philosophy that had made formation bombing successful: perfect execution of standardized procedures under any conditions, relentless training until every action became instinctive, selection of lead crews based on demonstrated performance rather than seniority. These principles defined SAC culture and made it arguably the most disciplined and capable military organization in American history. The advent of surface-to-air missiles and advanced radar-guided anti-aircraft systems eventually made formation flying obsolete for combat operations. Modern bombers operate individually, using electronic countermeasures, terrain-following flight, and stealth technology rather than mutual defensive fire. But the fundamental principle that formation bombing embodied, using coordination and standardization to multiply individual effectiveness, remains relevant in contemporary military operations. Network-centric warfare, distributed operations coordinated through digital systems, synchronized strikes by multiple platforms represent the conceptual descendants of formation bombings, insight that coordination produces results beyond the sum of individual efforts. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.